I built his life. I deserve his fortune. Those words still rang in my ears as I sat in the courthouse parking lot, gripping the steering wheel of my truck. My name is Alan Morrison. I'm 49 years old, and I'd just watched my wife of 23 years tell a judge she deserved $14 million of my money, half my construction company, and the lake house my grandfather built with his own hands. Victoria had always been good with words. That's how she'd gotten her claws into me back in college when I was a broke kid from Billings, Montana, working 3 jobs to pay for engineering classes. She was studying journalism then, had this way of making everything sound reasonable, even when it wasn't. But sitting there, watching her lawyer present their case like I was some deadbeat who'd stumbled into wealth, I felt something cold settle in my chest. 23 years of marriage, and she talked about me like I was a stranger who'd stolen her life. The thing was, I'd been feeling this coming for months. Little things that didn't add up. The way she'd started asking detailed questions about the business finances. How she'd insisted on updating our insurance policies last spring. The sudden interest in my daily schedule, wanting to know exactly where I'd be and when. I'd caught her going through my desk drawer 2 weeks ago. She claimed she was looking for stamps, but I kept those in the kitchen. When I asked what she really needed, she got that look on her face, the one that said I was being paranoid and controlling. That night, I'd started paying closer attention, started noticing how many phone calls she took in the other room, how she'd changed the password on her laptop, how she'd begun scheduling lunch meetings with people she wouldn't name. My lawyer, George Brennan, had warned me this day might come ugly. George had handled my business contracts for 15 years, knew Victoria well enough to see through her charm. He'd pulled me aside after our first consultation and said something that stuck. Alan, in my experience, when someone starts planning a divorce this carefully, they've been thinking about it a lot longer than you realize. Now, watching her walk out of the courthouse with her attorney, I understood what he meant. This wasn't about irreconcilable differences or growing apart. This was calculated. She wanted to take everything I'd built and leave me with nothing but the clothes on my back. Victoria climbed into her silver BMW, the one I'd bought her last Christmas, and drove away without looking back. She had no idea what was waiting for her in that manila folder sitting on my passenger seat. Some betrayals you see coming. Others hit you like a freight train. But the worst ones are the kind where you realize you've been played for years, and you were too trusting to notice the game. I started Morrison Construction right out of college with a beat-up pickup truck and a toolbox my dad gave me. Victoria was there from the beginning, or at least I thought she was. She'd bring me coffee on job sites, help me organize invoices at our kitchen table, pose for pictures when we landed our first big commercial contract. Back then, she seemed proud of what we were building together. She'd tell her friends how I'd started with nothing and worked my way up to residential developments, then commercial projects. When we landed the contract to build the new medical center in downtown Billings, she threw a party and made sure everyone knew her husband was the man behind Morrison Construction. But somewhere along the way, things shifted. I was too busy growing the business to notice when she stopped asking about projects or celebrating our wins. Too focused on providing for our future to see that she'd started viewing my success differently. We never had kids. Victoria said she wasn't ready, then later claimed the business took up too much of my time for us to be proper parents. I regretted that decision for years, wondering if children might have given us something stronger to build on than just money and convenience. My parents died within 2 years of each other when I was in my early 40s. Dad had a heart attack and Mom followed 6 months later like she couldn't bear to be without him. They'd left me the lake house and 40 acres on Flathead Lake, land that had been in our family since the 1940s. Victoria had immediately started talking about selling it, said it was too far from town and too much maintenance for a vacation place we barely used. I refused. That land meant something to me, represented something about where I came from and what my family had built. Victoria stopped bringing it up, but I caught her looking at real estate listings for lakefront property, calculating what our place might be worth. The warning signs had been there for months, maybe years. Phone calls that stopped when I walked into the room. Bills for lunches at expensive restaurants that she'd claimed were with college friends I'd never met. A sudden interest in our financial statements and insurance policies that she'd never cared about before. Last month I'd found a business card in her purse for a private investigator. When I confronted her, she said she'd picked it up for a friend who suspected her husband of cheating. But the card had notes written on the back in Victoria's handwriting. My daily schedule, the address of our office building, questions about asset searches. That night I'd called George Brennan and told him to prepare for the worst. George had been handling my business legal work since the early days, knew Victoria socially, had watched our marriage from the outside. His exact words were, "Alan, get your house in order. This feels like a setup." I should have listened to my gut sooner. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered by a process server who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Victoria had moved out the weekend before, claiming she needed space to think. She'd taken her clothes, her jewelry, and the silver BMW. Left behind 23 years of marriage like it was nothing more than a rental agreement she'd decided not to renew. I sat at my kitchen table reading through the demands her lawyer had laid out, and felt something cold and final settle in my chest. She wasn't asking for half of everything. She was demanding specific pieces of my life, calculated down to the dollar. 14 million in cash and assets, 50% ownership of Morrison Construction, the lake house, and all 40 acres of family land, spousal support of $15,000 a month for 10 years, even the rights to use the Morrison name for her planned interior design business. She'd done her homework. Every demand was designed to either destroy what I'd built or force me to pay her to keep it. The lake house demand hurt the most. She knew that land was sacred to me, knew I'd fight harder to keep it than anything else, which meant she'd probably trade it away for something else she wanted more. But the thing that really got to me was the timeline. According to the legal filing, she'd been planning this for 8 months. 8 months of sitting across from me at dinner, sleeping in the same bed, pretending we were working through our problems while she systematically documented every asset I owned. I called George immediately. "She wants everything," I told him. "I know," he said. "I got a copy this morning. Alan, this isn't a normal divorce proceeding. This is a hostile takeover disguised as marriage dissolution. What are my options? Limited, if we play by their rules. But there might be another way." That afternoon I drove out to the lake house, sat on the dock my grandfather had built, looking out at water that had been in my family for 3 generations. Victoria had never understood why this place mattered to me. To her, it was just real estate with a nice view. I thought about the early years when we'd drive up here on weekends and she'd actually seem happy. Before the business took off, before money became the measure of everything, there had been a time when Victoria Morrison was the woman I wanted to spend my life with. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone who saw my success as something she was entitled to, rather than something we'd built together. I made 2 phone calls from that dock. The first was to my accountant, telling him to freeze access to all our joint accounts pending the divorce proceedings. The second was to a private investigator George had recommended, a former police detective named Patricia Hayes who specialized in financial fraud cases. If Victoria wanted to play hardball, I'd give her a game she'd never forget. The water was still as glass that evening, reflecting the mountains like a mirror. Soon Victoria would discover that some reflections show you things you'd rather not see. I filed my counter-response 2 weeks later. George had crafted it carefully. We weren't just defending against Victoria's demands, we were questioning the basis for them. How had she calculated the value of my business? Where had she gotten the financial records she'd cited? Who had helped her assess the worth of private assets that weren't part of our joint property? Victoria's reaction was swift and vicious. Within 24 hours, I received a restraining order claiming I'd been threatening her. According to her sworn statement, I'd followed her to her new apartment, sent intimidating text messages, and made verbal threats about what would happen if she proceeded with the divorce. None of it was true. I had her phone records to prove it. No threatening messages, no contact at all since she'd moved out. But the restraining order meant I couldn't approach her, couldn't contact her directly, and looked like an unstable, controlling husband to anyone who didn't know the facts. The local newspaper picked up the story. Prominent businessmen served with restraining order in contentious divorce. Victoria had fed them just enough information to make me look bad without mentioning her $14 million demands or the suspicious timing of her legal preparations. My business started feeling the impact immediately. 2 potential clients called to postpone meetings. The bank that handled our construction loans requested additional documentation for a project we'd already been approved for. Nothing direct, nothing they could be sued for, but enough to make my life complicated. George warned me this was just the beginning. She's trying to isolate you, make you look unreliable and dangerous. Classic strategy. If she can damage your business and reputation, she strengthens her case for maximum financial support. But the worst part was discovering how deep her preparation went. Patricia Hayes, the private investigator, had been working quietly for 10 days when she called with her first report. "Mr. Morrison, your wife has been planning this for at least 18 months, not 8. I found evidence of consultation with 3 different divorce attorneys, 2 different private investigators, and a forensic accountant who specializes in business valuations. 18 months. She's been building a case against you since before your parents died. The timing of this divorce isn't coincidental. She waited until the lake house property was fully transferred to your name, until your business finished its best year on record, until your personal net worth hit its peak." I felt sick. While I'd been grieving my parents and building our future, Victoria had been calculating how to take it all away. "There's more," Patricia continued. "She's been secretly recording conversations with you for months. Phone calls, dinner conversations, private discussions about the business. She's got hundreds of hours of audio that she plans to use to prove you're controlling and financially manipulative." "Is that legal?" "In Montana, only one party needs to consent to recording a conversation. Since she was part of every conversation she recorded, it's admissible in court." The full scope of Victoria's betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Every intimate conversation, every private discussion about our future, every moment I thought we were alone. She'd been gathering evidence to use against me. That night, I sat in my empty house and realized I wasn't just fighting a divorce proceeding. I was fighting a woman who'd spent nearly 2 years systematically documenting my life, studying my weaknesses, and building a legal case designed to destroy everything I'd worked for. She'd turned our marriage into a reconnaissance mission, but Patricia had found something else, something Victoria didn't know about. "Mr. Morrison, there's one more thing. Your wife has been meeting regularly with someone you know, someone who's been feeding her inside information about your business operations." My blood went cold. "Who?" "Your business partner, Kyle Brennan, George's younger brother." Kyle Brennan had been my business partner for 12 years. George's younger brother, a commercial architect who'd joined Morrison Construction when we started bidding on larger projects that required his design expertise. I'd trusted him with company finances, project planning, and confidential client information. I'd also trusted him with my marriage. Patricia's report was thorough and devastating. Kyle had been meeting with Victoria twice a week for the past 6 months, always at small restaurants outside Billings where they were unlikely to be seen by anyone who knew us both. The meetings had started as brief coffee conversations, but had grown into lengthy dinner discussions where Victoria pumped Kyle for detailed information about our business operations. She's been asking him about cash flow, upcoming contracts, equipment valuations, and real estate holdings, Patricia explained. Your partner's been providing her with information that should be protected by business confidentiality agreements. But it was worse than corporate espionage. Patricia had photographed them together, and their body language told a story that went beyond business consultation. Victoria and Kyle weren't just sharing information, they were sharing intimacy. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. "The business meeting started 6 months ago, but I found evidence of contact going back 14 months. Text messages, phone calls, hotel receipts. Mr. Morrison, your wife has been having an affair with your business partner since before your parents died." The timeline made sickening sense. Victoria's sudden disinterest in our marriage, her questions about the business, her reluctance to spend time at the lake house. It had all started around the time Kyle had begun working more closely with our residential development projects. I thought back to company dinners, holiday parties, casual conversations where Kyle had been present. He'd heard me talk about family finances, inheritance plans, and my intentions for the lake house. He'd known exactly what Victoria would need to build her divorce case. There's more, Patricia continued. I believe they're planning to start a business together after the divorce is finalized. Victoria's interior design company isn't just a side project. It's meant to be a full partnership with Kyle. She gets your money in the divorce settlement. He provides architectural services, and they build a competing business using the client relationships he's developed while working for you. The betrayal was total. My wife and my business partner had been planning to destroy my life and build their new one on the ruins. I called George immediately. When I told him what Patricia had discovered, the silence on the phone lasted nearly a minute. Jesus Christ, Alan, Kyle's my brother. I know. This is going to destroy our family. He destroyed it when he decided to betray our business and help my wife steal everything I've built. George's voice was quiet, professional. What do you want to do? I want to beat them at their own game. How? I'd been thinking about that since Patricia's call. Victoria and Kyle had spent months building their case against me, but they'd made one critical mistake. They'd underestimated how well I knew my own business and how carefully I'd documented everything over the years. They want my financial records? I'll give them financial records. They want to know about business valuations? I'll provide complete transparency. They want to play games with asset assessment? I'll show them how the game really works. Alan, what are you planning? I'm planning to give Victoria exactly what she's asking for, all of it, every single demand she's made. That doesn't make sense. It will. The key to everything was a document Victoria had never seen, filed 18 months ago in a safety deposit box she didn't know existed. After my parents died, I'd restructured Morrison Construction to protect it from exactly the kind of legal assault Victoria was mounting. Working with a corporate attorney from Denver, I'd created a complex business structure that separated the company's valuable assets from its operational liability. The Alan Morrison, who owned 51% of Morrison Construction, was technically just an employee of Morrison Holdings, a Montana limited liability company that owned the real estate, equipment, and intellectual property that made the construction business valuable. Morrison Holdings was controlled by the Morrison Family Trust, which I'd established using my inheritance from my parents' estate. Victoria could demand half of Alan Morrison's share in Morrison Construction, but that share was only worth about $200,000 in equipment and current contracts. The real value, the land, buildings, heavy machinery, and established client relationships, belonged to entities she had no legal claim to. Kyle had been feeding her information about Morrison Construction's revenue and assets, but he didn't know about the holding company structure because it had been established before he'd been granted access to the financial records. To him, it looked like I owned everything directly, but the real masterstroke was the lake house. 3 months after my parents died, I'd transferred the property to the Morrison Family Trust with a specific provision. It could never be sold or transferred outside the family bloodline. If my marriage ended without children, the property would eventually pass to my cousin's kids in Colorado. Victoria could demand the lake house in the divorce, but I literally didn't have the legal authority to give it to her. The trust documents made that impossible. Patricia had helped me gather evidence of Victoria's affair with Kyle, but I wasn't planning to use it for revenge. I was planning to use it for leverage. Here's what's going to happen, I told George. On the day of the final hearing, I'm going to give Victoria everything she's asking for. $14 million, half of Morrison Construction, spousal support, everything. Alan, you can't afford that. I can't afford not to. When the judge awards her those assets and she tries to collect, she's going to discover that most of what she's been promised doesn't exist in the form she thinks it does. The business she gets half of is worth almost nothing. The cash settlement comes from accounts that are controlled by the trust, not by me personally. What happens then? Then I offer her a choice. She can spend the next 5 years in court trying to break the trust and challenge the business structure, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on legal fees with no guarantee of success. Or she can accept a reasonable cash settlement and walk away. How much? $2 million. Enough for her to start over. Not enough to destroy what I've built. George was quiet for a moment. What about Kyle? Kyle's partnership agreement has a morality clause. If he's found to have violated his fiduciary duty to the company, or engaged in behavior that damages Morrison Construction's reputation, he can be bought out at book value with 30 days' notice. The affair is a violation of his fiduciary duty, since he was sharing confidential business information with someone who intended to use it against the company. Patricia has enough evidence to prove that in court. The plan was elegant and brutal. Victoria and Kyle had spent months building a trap for me, but they'd built it using incomplete information. Now they were going to discover what happens when you try to steal something that doesn't belong to the person you're stealing from. The courtroom was packed when Judge Harrison called our case. Victoria sat at the plaintiff's table wearing a black dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, projecting the image of a wronged wife who'd sacrificed everything for her husband's success. Her lawyer, a sharp-dressed man from Missoula named David Walsh, presented their case with theatrical precision. Victoria had built Alan Morrison's life, they argued. She'd supported his business ventures, managed their home, sacrificed her own career ambitions for his success. Now she was entitled to half of everything they'd built together. When Judge Harrison asked if I contested any of Victoria's demands, I surprised everyone in the room. No, Your Honor. I agree to all of them. Victoria's head snapped toward me. Her lawyer looked confused. Even George seemed startled. You agree to the $14 million settlement? Judge Harrison asked. Yes, Your Honor. Half ownership of Morrison Construction? Yes, Your Honor. The lake house property? Yes, Your Honor. Victoria was smiling now, probably thinking she'd broken me completely. Kyle, sitting in the gallery behind her, looked smug. Judge Harrison reviewed the terms one more time, then signed the divorce decree. Mr. Morrison, you have 60 days to comply with the property transfers and financial settlements. That's when I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. Your Honor, there's one additional document I'd like to submit for the record. I handed the folder to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Harrison. Inside were the corporate structure documents for Morrison Holdings, the trust paperwork for the family land, and Patricia's investigative report documenting Victoria's affair and Kyle's breach of fiduciary duty. Judge Harrison read for several minutes, while the courtroom remained silent. Victoria's smile faded as she watched his expression change. Mr. Morrison, the judge said finally, it appears the assets your wife has been awarded may not be accessible in the manner she anticipated. That's correct, Your Honor, but I'm prepared to honor the spirit of the settlement with a revised offer. I turned to face Victoria directly. $2 million cash, and you walk away from everything else. Take it or spend the next 5 years in court. Her face went white. Victoria's lawyer requested an immediate recess to review the documents I'd submitted. When they returned to the courtroom 30 minutes later, Victoria looked like she'd aged 10 years. Walsh's confident demeanor had evaporated completely. Your Honor, Walsh said, my client would like to accept Mr. Morrison's revised settlement offer. Judge Harrison looked at Victoria. Mrs. Morrison, do you understand that you're accepting $2 million instead of the $14 million previously awarded? Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. Yes, Your Honor. The papers were signed that afternoon. Victoria took her $2 million and disappeared from Billings within a week. I heard later that she'd moved to Seattle, where she tried to start an interior design business that failed within 6 months. Kyle's buyout was finalized 3 days after the divorce. Book value for his partnership share came to $87,000, considerably less than the millions he'd thought he was helping Victoria steal. George handled the transaction professionally, but I knew it destroyed their family relationship. Kyle left Montana and never came back. I drove out to the lake house that weekend, sat on my grandfather's dock, and watched the sun set over water that would stay in my family for generations to come. The mountains reflected perfectly in the still surface, just like they had when I was a boy learning to fish from my father. Morrison Construction thrived. Without the distraction of a failing marriage and the drain of Kyle's disloyalty, we landed 3 major contracts that fall and expanded into commercial development throughout western Montana. I never remarried. Some betrayals teach you things about trust that can't be unlearned, but I built a good life. honest work, family land, and the satisfaction of knowing that when someone tried to destroy everything I'd built, I was strong enough and smart enough to protect it. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be destroyed. I get the house and the company, he just gets the tools. My name is Carl. I'm 32 and I just watched my sister Penelope announce my inheritance like she was reading a grocery list. The conference room at Henderson Law Offices felt smaller with every laugh that followed her words. My Uncle Wesley chuckled. My cousin Brooklyn nodded like she'd expected this all along. Even my Aunt Catherine smiled behind her coffee cup. Penelope sat across from me, her manicured fingers drumming against the mahogany table. She wore her best business suit, the navy one she'd bought for job interviews she never went to. Her marketing degree had been hanging on her wall for 8 years, but she'd spent most of that time planning what she'd do when my dad's construction business became hers. "Poor Carl," she said, glancing around the room. "Dad always said you were good with your hands. At least you'll have something to remember him by." The lawyer, Mr. Garrison, hadn't spoken yet. He sat at the head of the table with a stack of documents, his expression unreadable. I'd known him since I was 12. He'd handled every contract, every incorporation filing, every legal document for my dad's business. He knew things the family didn't. I stayed quiet. That's what I'd learned to do over the years. Let Penelope talk while I worked. She talked about expansion plans and new market opportunities at family dinners. I was the one who actually ran the crews, managed the contracts, and kept the clients happy. But today, sitting in that room, listening to her divide up my father's legacy like she was dealing cards, something felt different. The tools she mentioned so casually weren't just hammers and saws. They were precision equipment worth more than her car. The laser-guided surveying instruments, the custom fabrication machinery, the specialized concrete forms that had taken years to perfect, equipment that required licenses, certifications, and years of experience to operate properly. Penelope had visited the workshop exactly 3 times in the past 5 years. Each time she'd complained about the noise and dust. She'd never held a blueprint, never talked to a subcontractor, never spent a dawn-to-dusk day making sure a foundation was poured correctly. But the family saw her business suit and heard her confident voice discussing profit margins she'd learned about in textbooks. They saw my work clothes and assumed I was just another laborer who happened to share my dad's name. Mr. Garrison cleared his throat and opened the folder. Something in his expression made me sit straighter. After 30 years of legal practice, he'd developed a poker face that could hide anything. Today, though, I caught something in his eyes, a glimmer that looked almost like anticipation. My dad started Bennett Construction 22 years ago with a pickup truck and a borrowed tool set. I was 10 when I first helped him carry lumber. Penelope was 8 and more interested in her dolls than watching concrete cure. By the time I turned 18, I was running crews and reading blueprints. My dad enrolled me in business management classes at the community college. Nights and weekends, I learned about contracts, liability insurance, and corporate structures. Penelope went to State University for marketing, convinced she'd return to revolutionize the family business with modern advertising techniques. While she was pledging sororities and studying consumer psychology, I was learning why you never skimp on rebar and how to bid commercial projects. My dad started bringing me to client meetings. I memorized building codes and developed relationships with suppliers. When Penelope graduated, she expected to step into a management position. Instead, she found a business that was running fine without her marketing expertise. "This company needs a social media presence," she'd announce at Sunday dinners. "We need to modernize our approach." My dad would nod politely while I explained which jobs we'd landed that week and which contracts were coming up for renewal. Real work. Tangible results. But Penelope's presentation skills made her sound more professional than my reports from the field. The warning signs had been there for months. Family members started asking Penelope about the business instead of me. She'd answer with confidence, describing expansion plans I'd never heard of, and market strategies that existed only in her imagination. She spoke about our clients like she knew them personally, though she'd met maybe 3 of them at company picnics. Last Christmas, she'd shown up with a business plan she'd written for the company's future. 47 pages of market analysis and growth projections. She'd presented it like she was unveiling the cure for cancer. The family had been impressed. I'd noticed she'd gotten our annual revenue wrong by nearly $500,000. 3 months ago, when my dad started getting sick, Penelope began talking about succession planning. She'd researched other construction companies that had transitioned to the next generation. She had spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations. She spoke with the authority of someone who'd inherited something that already belonged to her. I never corrected her in front of the family. What was the point? They'd already decided who looked like a future business owner and who looked like hired help. Penelope's MBA classes had taught her to speak their language. My calloused hands and steel-toed boots told a different story. But late at night, when I was reviewing contracts and scheduling permits, I remembered something my dad had told me 6 years ago. Something about protecting the business from people who confused enthusiasm with competence. Something about making sure the right person was legally in control when the time came. The moment came during a family dinner 2 weeks after my dad's funeral. Penelope was describing her 5-year vision for Bennett Construction. New markets, corporate partnerships, a complete rebrand with professional logo design. "I've already contacted 3 potential investors," she said, cutting her steak with the precision of someone making an important point. "They're very interested in the company's growth potential." My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. "Investors for what?" "Expansion capital. We need to think bigger, Carl. Dad was too conservative. We could double our revenue within 3 years if we're smart about it." The family nodded along. Wesley mentioned how proud my dad would be to see his business growing. Brooklyn talked about modern construction techniques she'd read about online. Catherine suggested Penelope should write a book about family business transitions. That's when I realized they'd all convinced themselves of something that wasn't true. They'd created a version of reality where Penelope was the natural heir to a construction empire, and I was the loyal employee who'd stick around to handle the dirty work. I excused myself early and drove to the office. The building was dark, but I had keys to everything. I went to the filing cabinet where my dad kept the corporate documents. Everything was there, exactly as I remembered. Articles of incorporation filed 6 years ago. Stock certificates. Board resolutions. My name was on everything that mattered. The business had never been in my dad's name alone. It had been incorporated as Bennett Construction Incorporated, with specific ownership structures designed to protect it from inheritance taxes and family disputes. I owned 75% of the stock. I was listed as president and chief executive officer. My dad had structured it that way the year Penelope graduated college, right around the time she started talking about modernizing the business without understanding how it actually worked. I sat in that office until midnight, reading through 6 years of corporate filings. Every major contract had been signed with my name and title. Every insurance policy listed me as the primary contact. The business banking accounts required my signature for anything over $500. Penelope didn't even have check-signing privileges, but she didn't know any of this. None of them did. My dad had handled the legal paperwork quietly, probably hoping he'd have more time to explain the arrangement to the family gradually. Instead, cancer had moved faster than his plans for gentle revelations. I drove home that night feeling something I hadn't experienced in months. Not anger exactly, more like clarity. For 6 years I'd been running a company I legally owned, while my family assumed I was just the reliable worker who'd inherited some tools. Tomorrow, at the reading of the will, Mr. Garrison would have some interesting news to share. I found myself looking forward to the meeting in a way that surprised me. The will reading was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. I arrived early and took a seat facing the door. Penelope entered like she was walking into her own boardroom, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing confidence like expensive perfume. The rest of the family filed in behind her, settling into their chairs with the satisfied air of people about to witness something they'd expected all along. "Before we begin," Penelope announced, "I want everyone to know that I'm committed to honoring Dad's legacy. Bennett Construction will continue to serve this community with integrity and excellence." Wesley beamed at her like she just delivered the Gettysburg Address. "Your father would be so proud, sweetheart." "Carl will always have a place with the company, of course," she continued, glancing at me with what she probably thought was gracious magnanimity. His experience and skills are valuable assets. I'm hoping he'll consider staying on as operations manager. Operations manager of a company I already owned and operated. Mr. Garrison had been shuffling papers throughout Penelope's speech, his expression professionally neutral. Now he looked up and adjusted his glasses. "Shall we begin with the formal reading?" he asked. The will itself was straightforward. Penelope inherited the house on Maple Street, along with its contents and the attached 3-car garage. There were smaller bequests to other family members. Wesley got my dad's fishing boat. Catherine received his collection of vintage tools. Brooklyn inherited a small cash bequest and some jewelry that had belonged to my grandmother. And to my son Carl, Mr. Garrison read, "I leave my complete set of professional tools, machinery, and equipment, along with any vehicles used in the operation of Bennett Construction." Penelope smiled indulgently. The family exchanged glances that said they'd expected exactly this division of assets. The daughter got the real inheritance. The son got the worker's tools. "That's it?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "That's the extent of the will," Mr. Garrison confirmed. Penelope leaned back in her chair, already mentally rearranging the office furniture. "Well, I think Dad made his intentions pretty clear. Carl gets the tools he knows how to use, and I get the responsibility of running the actual business." "About that," Mr. Garrison said quietly. Something in his tone made everyone stop talking. "There's something we need to discuss regarding Bennett Construction." He pulled out a different set of documents. The business entity itself wasn't part of Mr. Bennett's estate to bequeath. Penelope's smile faltered slightly. "What do you mean?" "Bennett Construction has been a corporation for 6 years. It's owned by shareholders, not by individuals who can pass it along through a will." The room went very quiet. Wesley shifted in his seat. Catherine set down her coffee cup. Brooklyn looked confused. "I don't understand," Penelope said, her voice losing some of its earlier confidence. "Of course Dad owned the business. His name was on everything. The business operates under the corporate name," Mr. Garrison explained patiently. "But the actual ownership is determined by stock certificates issued when the company was incorporated." I watched Penelope's face as understanding began to creep in. She wasn't stupid. She'd taken enough business classes to know what corporate structure meant, but she'd never thought to ask about the specific legal arrangement of our family business. "Who owns the stock?" she asked, though I could see she was beginning to suspect the answer. Mr. Garrison consulted his documents. According to the corporate filings, Carl Bennett holds 75% of outstanding shares. He's also listed as the corporation's president and chief executive officer. The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet. This one had weight to it like the moment before a thunderclap. Penelope stared at the documents as if they might change their contents under her gaze. "That's impossible. Carl doesn't even have a business degree." "The incorporation papers are quite clear," Mr. Garrison said, spreading them across the table. "Bennett Construction Incorporated was established 6 years ago with specific ownership structures designed to ensure business continuity and operational control." I watched my family's faces as they processed this information. Wesley looked like he'd been told Santa Claus was a tax auditor. Catherine was reading over the documents with the intensity of someone decoding ancient hieroglyphics. Brooklyn appeared to be questioning everything she'd ever understood about family dynamics. "But I've been planning the company's future," Penelope said, her voice smaller now. "I've been developing strategies, talking to potential clients, researching expansion opportunities." "With what authority?" I asked quietly. She turned to me with something approaching desperation. "Carl, you know Dad wanted me involved in the business. He always talked about keeping it in the family." "He did keep it in the family. He put it in my name." Mr. Garrison cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps I should explain the timeline. The incorporation took place shortly after Miss Penelope graduated from college. At that time, Carl had been working in the business for several years and had completed his business management certification. That was the detail Penelope had never bothered to learn. While she was studying marketing theory and consumer psychology, I'd been earning actual business credentials: project management certification, construction business law, financial planning for small corporations. My dad had insisted on it. The corporate structure was designed to reflect actual operational responsibility, Mr. Garrison continued. Carl had been managing contracts, overseeing crews, and handling client relationships. The legal ownership follows the practical management structure that was already in place. Wesley finally found his voice. You mean Carl has been running the company this whole time? He's been the legal president for 6 years, Mr. Garrison confirmed. All major contracts have been executed under his authority. He's the primary signatory on business accounts and insurance policies. I pulled out my business cards and distributed them around the table. Carl Bennett, President, Bennett Construction Incorporated. I'd been carrying them for 6 years, but the family had never bothered to read the title carefully. The tools mentioned in the will, Mr. Garrison added, include specialized equipment worth approximately $150,000. This equipment is essential to the corporation's operations and remains under Carl's control as both inheritance and business assets. Penelope was doing math in her head, and I could see her reaching uncomfortable conclusions. What about the contracts I was discussing with potential clients? What contracts? I asked. The Henderson Shopping Center project, the municipal building renovation, the residential development on Oak Street. Those are all jobs we're already doing, I said. Henderson's been our client for 3 years. The municipal contract was signed last month. The Oak Street development is scheduled to break ground next week. She'd been taking credit for my work without realizing it. The impressive client roster she'd been discussing with family members wasn't her vision for the company's future. It was the company's present reality. The room felt smaller with each revelation. My inheritance hadn't been the consolation prize of a few tools and a handshake. My inheritance had been confirmed ownership of a successful business I'd already been running. The meeting ended with Penelope requesting copies of all corporate documents and my family promising to discuss everything over dinner that weekend. I drove back to the job site on Oak Street, where my crew was pouring foundation footers for a 12-unit housing development worth $800,000. My foreman, Vincent, met me at the trailer. How did the lawyer meeting go? About like I expected. He nodded. Vincent had worked for my dad for 15 years. He knew who actually ran the company, regardless of what the family thought. Your sister still planning to modernize our operations? She's going to have some adjustments to make. That evening, Penelope called me 3 times. I let the calls go to voicemail. Her messages progressed from confused to frustrated to demanding explanations I didn't owe her. The 4th call came at 11 p.m. Carl, we need to talk. About what? About this corporate structure thing. There has to be some mistake. No mistake. But I've been telling people I'm taking over the business. I've made commitments based on inheriting the company. That was her problem, not mine. What kind of commitments? I may have mentioned to some potential investors that I would be in a position to make decisions about expansion funding. I sat up straighter. What investors? Just some people I met through networking events. They're interested in construction companies with growth potential. Penelope, you don't have authority to discuss business investments with anyone. I thought I would after the will reading. Well, now you know different. The silence stretched between us. Finally, she asked, what happens now? Now you figure out what you actually want to do with your life. I hung up and went back to reviewing the next day's work schedules. The Henderson project needed materials delivered by 7 a.m. The municipal building renovation required a progress inspection Thursday morning. The Oak Street development had a concrete delivery scheduled for Friday. Real work. Real deadlines. Real responsibilities that wouldn't wait for family drama to resolve itself. The next morning, I found Penelope waiting by my truck when I arrived at the office. She looked like she hadn't slept. I need to understand something, she said without preamble. Have you been planning this? Planning what? This whole corporate ownership thing. Did you and Dad set this up to cut me out? I unlocked the office door and let her follow me inside. The walls were covered with project photos, client contracts, and safety certifications. 6 years of work she'd never bothered to notice. Dad set it up to protect the business, I said, starting the coffee maker. From people who might confuse good intentions with actual competence. That's not fair. Fair would have been you asking about the business structure before announcing you were taking it over. She stood in the middle of the office, looking around like she'd never seen it before. In many ways, she hadn't. She'd visited maybe a dozen times in 6 years, usually to borrow something or deliver messages from family members. So what am I supposed to do now? Whatever you want, just not with my company. My phone rang. Henderson Development with a question about material specifications for their next project. While I talked through the technical details, Penelope wandered around the office, finally seeing the evidence of 6 years of work she'd been planning to inherit. When I finished the call, she was reading a client testimonial letter hanging next to my business license. "They all know you," she said quietly. "They should. I've been doing business with them for years." She left without saying goodbye. The confrontation I'd been expecting came 2 weeks later at my Uncle Wesley's birthday party. The family had gathered at his house for dinner, and the conversation inevitably turned to Bennett Construction's future. Penelope had spent 2 weeks researching corporate law and consulting with business advisors. She arrived at the party armed with legal terminology and righteous indignation. "I've been consulting with attorneys," she announced over dessert. "There are legal remedies for situations like this: minority shareholder rights, fiduciary duty violations, breach of family trust." Wesley nodded supportively. "That's the spirit, sweetheart. Don't let anyone take advantage of you." Catherine chimed in. "Your father never would have wanted the family business to cause division between his children. They'd convinced themselves that I'd somehow manipulated the situation, that the corporate structure was a recent development designed to cheat Penelope out of her rightful inheritance. The truth was simpler and more uncomfortable. They'd never bothered to understand how the business actually worked. "I'm prepared to challenge the corporate arrangements in court if necessary," Penelope continued, looking directly at me. "Family businesses have certain obligations to all family members." I set down my coffee cup and pulled out my phone. "Before you hire more lawyers, there's something you should see." I showed her the screen. Bennett Construction's latest contract, signed the previous Friday. Municipal water treatment plant expansion, $2.3 million scheduled to begin next month. "This is what Dad built," I said quietly. Not the idea of a construction company. Not the potential for a construction company. The actual construction company that employs 12 full-time workers and generates over $4 million in annual revenue. Penelope stared at the contract amount. $4 million? Last year's gross revenue. This year we're tracking toward $5.2 million. The number hung in the air like an unwelcome truth. Penelope's inheritance assumptions had been based on a much smaller business, something she could learn to manage through enthusiasm and good intentions. The reality was a complex operation requiring specialized knowledge, established relationships, and years of experience she didn't possess. "The corporate structure wasn't designed to keep you out," I continued. "It was designed to keep the business running when Dad couldn't anymore." Penelope never filed any legal challenges. Her attorney apparently explained that corporate ownership structures established 6 years earlier, with clear documentation and legitimate business purposes, weren't something you could overturn through family grievance proceedings. She moved to Denver 3 months later, taking a marketing position with a tech startup. At Christmas dinner, she was careful to ask about the business, rather than making assumptions about it. We'd found a way to be siblings again, though the dynamic was permanently different. Wesley still occasionally suggested that I should consider bringing Penelope back into the company as a partner, but his suggestions carried less conviction now. The business results spoke louder than family politics. Catherine made fewer comments about modernization and marketing strategies. Brooklyn developed a genuine interest in construction management and started asking practical questions about project scheduling and client relations. The family had learned to distinguish between appearing successful and being successful. Penelope's confident presentations had impressed them because they sounded professional. My work had been invisible to them because it happened in the field, with clients they'd never met, solving problems they'd never considered. Bennett Construction expanded into commercial roofing the following year. We hired 6 additional workers and opened a satellite office in the next county. The business that Penelope had wanted to inherit for its potential became something larger under the management of someone who understood both its limitations and its possibilities. In the end, the inheritance had revealed something my dad probably knew but never had the chance to explain directly. Ownership isn't about family birthright or good intentions. It's about competence, commitment, and the willingness to take responsibility for consequences that extend beyond yourself. The tools I inherited weren't just equipment. They were the means to build something that would last, and that's exactly what I did.